74,000 years ago, the sky went dark and stayed dark for 6 years. A volcano named Toba tore itself apart with a force no human has ever witnessed since. Ash buried continents in gray dust, choking the sun from the sky. Temperatures collapsed, forests died, and so did nearly everything that depended on them. Somewhere on this dying planet, our species was reduced to a number smaller than a small town. Some believe as few as 3,000 humans survived what came next. Every single person alive today may be descended from that one small, desperate group. On the South African coast, one buried cave still holds the evidence of how they survived. This was not a myth. This was the closest our species ever came to disappearing completely. One eruption, one bottleneck, and every human who has ever lived stands on the other side of it. This is the story of how humanity almost never happened. "74,000 years ago. The sun rose over Sumatra for the very last time in a very long while. By the time it set again, it would not be seen clearly for the next 6 years. Somewhere on this planet, at this exact moment, a tiny population of Homo sapiens is going about an ordinary day. They have no idea that within hours their entire species will be pushed to the very edge of extinction. This is not a myth, and it is not exaggeration. This is the story of the single closest call life on Earth has on record. One mountain, one eruption, and every human being who has ever lived is a direct descendant of whoever managed to survive what came next. Over the next 15 minutes, we are going to walk through exactly what happened. Hour by hour, year by year. And by the end, you may never look at a supervolcano the same way again. This is the Toba Catastrophe. To understand what happened, you first need to understand exactly what kind of mountain we are talking about. Toba was not an ordinary volcano. It did not have a single peak, a single crater, a single obvious warning sign. It was a supervolcano, a type so massive that its crater isn't measured in meters. It's measured in entire lakes. Today, the caldera it left behind is 100 kilometers long. Roughly the length of Long Island, filled almost entirely with water. Beneath Toba sat a magma chamber scientists believe held enough molten rock to bury the entire island of Manhattan under a layer 11 kilometers deep. For hundreds of thousands of years, that chamber slowly filled, pressure building beneath a lid of solid rock that could not hold forever. Then, on a single day, scientists still cannot pin down to the week, the lid finally gave way. In terms of sheer force, this was not comparable to any eruption in recorded human history. Mount St. Helens in 1980 ejected roughly 1 cubic kilometer of material. Toba ejected an estimated 2,800 cubic kilometers. That is nearly 3,000 times more material than one of the most destructive eruptions Americans alive today have ever personally witnessed. Pyroclastic flows, scorching rivers of gas and ash moving faster than a car on a highway, buried the surrounding land under hundreds of meters of rock within minutes. Within 1,000 kilometers, almost nothing built by nature or by early humans stood a real chance against what came out of that mountain. But the true danger of Toba was never the blast itself. It was what the blast sent up into the sky. An eruption this size doesn't just throw ash into the air. It throws sulfur, and an enormous quantity of it, directly into the stratosphere. Once in the stratosphere, that sulfur reacts with water vapor and forms a fine aerosol haze capable of circling the entire planet. Unlike ash, which falls out of the sky within days or weeks, this aerosol haze can linger for years, reflecting sunlight back into space before it ever touches the ground. Ash from Toba has been found in sediment layers as far away as the Arabian Sea, the South China Sea, and buried nearly 6,000 kilometers away in India, still centimeters thick. Picture gray ash coating rivers, plains, and forests across a stretch of the planet wider than the continental United States. With that much aerosol haze blocking incoming sunlight, some climate models suggest global temperatures dropped by 3 to 5 degrees Celsius on average. That is enough to shift entire growing seasons, collapse plant life that took millennia to establish, and starve out the animals that depended on it. This is what scientists call a volcanic winter. And Toba's version of it may be the most severe one our species has ever lived through. Forests best adapted to warm, stable climates died back across huge stretches of Africa and Asia, replaced within years by hardier grassland. For any large mammal relying on a stable food supply, this was already a catastrophe. For a small, scattered population of early humans across Africa, it was potentially far worse. This is where the story gets its name. The Toba Catastrophe Theory. In 1998, anthropologist Stanley Ambrose proposed something startling: that this single eruption came dangerously close to wiping out our entire species. His evidence didn't come from volcanic rock at all. It came from something hidden inside every human body alive today. Geneticists studying human DNA had noticed something strange. Modern humans show remarkably little genetic diversity for a species our size and age. Chimpanzees, our closest living relatives, show far more genetic variation among a few isolated groups than all 8 billion humans do across the entire planet combined. That kind of genetic bottleneck usually means one thing. At some point in the past, the breeding population of a species collapsed to a tiny fraction of its former size. Ambrose's theory connected these two puzzle pieces. The timing of Toba's eruption lines up almost exactly with the genetic signature of that bottleneck. His estimate was staggering. As few as 3,000 to 10,000 breeding humans may have survived the years that followed. Picture the entire human species alive today in the billions, funneled backward through a population smaller than a single American high school. If Ambrose was right, every person who has ever lived since, every empire, every language, every book ever written, descends from that one narrow surviving group. But here's the thing nobody tells you about the Toba Catastrophe Theory. The deeper scientists dug, the shakier it started to look. In 2018, a team led by archaeologist Curtis Marian began excavating a site called Pinnacle Point on the southern coast of what is now South Africa. This is the same coastal cave our story opened with. And what they found there rewrote a piece of this story completely. Layered directly into the soil at Pinnacle Point, researchers found microscopic shards of volcanic glass. A chemical fingerprint that matched Toba's eruption precisely. That meant they had found a single sealed layer of earth, representing the exact moment of the eruption itself, preserved undisturbed for 74,000 years. And in that layer, and in the layers directly above and below it, were unmistakable signs of continuous human activity. Stone tools, blades for processing shellfish, evidence of controlled fire used generation after generation. Whoever lived at Pinnacle Point did not vanish when the ash began to fall. They kept living there, making tools, eating, surviving, apparently without major interruption. That single buried layer of volcanic glass became one of the strongest pieces of evidence against a true global human near extinction. If Toba had truly starved out nearly all of humanity, this coastal population should have been among the very first to disappear. Instead, they appear to have barely noticed. Other researchers went looking for the same story in a very different place. The bottom of Lake Malawi in East Africa. In 2013, a team drilled sediment cores from the lakebed, reading thousands of years of climate history layer by layer. If Toba had truly triggered a severe years-long winter across East Africa, that record should show a dramatic, unmistakable cooling event exactly 74,000 years ago. It didn't. The climate signal at Lake Malawi barely shifts at all across the Toba eruption. No severe drought, no dramatic collapse, nothing close to the devastation the original theory predicted. So, which is it? A species-ending catastrophe or a survivable inconvenience for at least some corners of the planet? The honest answer scientists give today is more complicated and more interesting than either extreme. Toba was almost certainly a genuine severe climate event. The ash and aerosol evidence for that is not seriously disputed, but its effects were not uniform across the entire planet. Some regions may have suffered catastrophic cooling, while others, like the southern African coast, were buffered by geography and access to the sea. Coastal populations with reliable access to shellfish and marine food sources may have had something inland populations didn't. A food supply that didn't depend on a single failing growing season. As for the genetic bottleneck itself, many geneticists now believe it may not be about Toba specifically. A small population leaving Africa to populate the rest of the planet would naturally create exactly the same kind of genetic signature, regardless of any volcano. This is called a founder effect. A small founding population narrows genetic diversity, regardless of what made that group small in the first place. In other words, the bottleneck may be real. But Toba might not be the villain that caused it. It's entirely possible both are true at once. A genuinely brutal volcanic winter, survived by a population that was already fragile for entirely unrelated reasons. Either way, what happened next is not seriously in question. Somewhere in that surviving population, in coastal shelters like the one at Pinnacle Point, humanity did not just endure. It adapted. These survivors were already doing something no other species on the planet had fully mastered: systematically exploiting the sea as a reliable year-round food source. Within tens of thousands of years, descendants of these same populations began moving out of Africa in successive waves, eventually reaching every habitable continent on Earth. Every person alive today, on every continent, speaking every language, can trace their ancestry back through that same narrow window of survival. Whether the bottleneck was 3,000 people or 30,000. Whether Toba caused it directly or simply made an already fragile moment even harder. Our species came within a hair's width of not making it to see any of this. No cities. No written language. No descendants scrolling through a video about it 74,000 years later. All of it balanced for a handful of critical years on whether a small number of people scattered along an ancient coastline could keep finding enough to eat. They did, and that is the only reason any of the rest of this story, your story and mine, was ever able to happen at all. Geologists say Toba-scale eruptions occur roughly once every 100,000 years. And the same slow process is still happening today beneath other calderas like Yellowstone, with no eruption of this scale imminent. So the next time you hear the word supervolcano, remember Toba. Not just as a disaster, but as the closest edge our entire species has ever stood on and quietly stepped back from. This is the story of how humanity almost never happened. And somehow, against every likely outcome, happened anyway.